All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. And this week we are talking about creating back histories. So yeah, I don't know. I love creating back histories personally. But it's an interesting process. And sometimes I guess what we have is we have storytelling creates a what I would call a front history, right? It's a narrative that tells a story about something happening to some people, which then can be considered canon and built upon in future works. But very often we find ourselves wanting to understand how we got to where we are right now. And it's very useful to try to figure out how it is we got to where we are right now, and hopefully not to have to necessarily jump into 20 sequels before we can finish our first work. 20 prequels is what I'm saying, before we finish our very first completed story. Yeah, so first of all, have any of you guys found yourself working on back history questions when you write a story?
Oh yeah.
A little bit. Bits and pieces, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's cool. A lot of you have worked on it. So did that sense of back history sort of spring up as you created your story concept, or did you have to say, you know what, I got to figure a few things out and kind of have to work on it?
I didn't. My historical backstory in like the Fashion Kids novel, it's like it's completely off screen, and it's something that I needed to know for my own edification. And there is vague and brief mention of it, but it's not really anything that's like, at this point, not really going to appear on screen, and isn't really part of the plot in a lot of ways, but is sort of thing. It's stupid, but yeah, so just a little bit, but I didn't need it. I didn't really need it for the book, but I wanted to know it.
Well, that's really, really an interesting point. And I do want to ask everybody else about their experiences, but I want to take that point on for a second. The idea that none of the history is ever going to be on the page of your book is, in my view, not a reason not to figure it out. And the main reason that I would advocate for figuring it out is that the things you know will make their way onto the page, whether or not you explain them. They will deeply affect how you write what you write, even in ways that are not extremely obvious. So knowing the backstory is helpful for us to feel confident, like we know, hey, how all of this came to be. But it also does change the words we use when we're writing the front story. So yeah. Other people, tell me about your experience.
So there's a story I've written that I knew the catalyzing thing that happened in the culture, and I knew about the setup of the culture that I wanted to sort of be at the heart of the story and the central dilemma of the characters. And so I didn't end up doing a huge amount of backstory for that, except for one thing. There's a much larger work that I've been poking at for the last year and a half, where I thought I knew how this world worked, and it's a near future Earth. But the more I started writing on it, I kept getting stuck because I didn't have enough detail of what had led to the condition of everything as it was and what all the ramifications were, because I was trying to juggle a really complicated society with a bunch of different characters of different backgrounds. And so I've been doing a lot of work with myself, just trying to figure out what exactly is going on, and writing sort of the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation ethnography and history of this world before I get to the story I'm actually wanting to write. I don't know how many other stories I'm going to write in this world, but it's really important to me right now that all the pieces fit together, and it's not just some kind of veneer. I really want the history and the cultures of this world to actually make sense in relation to each other.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of that's going to show up on screen, especially because I also have a whole bunch of characters who are only being shown in flashback because they're all dead as the first chapter starts.
Okay. Well, I mean, Coco was all about people who were dead, so just kidding. I'm kind of joking around a bit, but just because the characters are dead, that don't let that hold them back.
Yeah, I have some live people.
Yeah. I think you make an interesting point that not all stories require a lot of back history. You know, sometimes you'll have just a single major past event that's really important to an understanding of a particular story, and other times it will require a lot more work. Yeah. So, other people having experiences that they'd like to share?
I think sometimes I will look at something and try to figure out, can I come up with a backstory that explains how I got here?
Mm-hmm.
And if I can, I'll do that. And if I can't, I'll have to think about what it is that I need from that particular thing. You know, why can't I explain it? Why can't I set it up?
Yep.
Is it because I don't like what the backstory would have to be? Or is it because it just doesn't make any sense at all?
Yeah.
You know, is it something that I need to change? Sometimes I'll get caught in backstory, character backstory.
Mm-hmm.
I will get caught in that. And that happened with one of the characters who's actually, you know, dead at the beginning of what I thought was the main story. And I got caught in the backstory of her spouse, because I needed his story, how he got to be there, who he was, in order to treat his son the way that he does. And the son was the main character, which is kind of elaborate and maybe more digging around than I needed.
Mm-hmm.
But figuring out what you can change, what you want to change. If you don't want to change it, can you come up with something to make it make sense without, and still have it be, you know, believable? Because making sense and being believable are not always the same thing.
Yep. What about you, Cliff? Thoughts?
Sure. So in general, I think of fiction as there's the building and the scaffolding, and the scaffolding is whatever you need to build the building, and then it's gone, you take it down.
Mm-hmm.
And so backstory can be, you know, part of the scaffolding, or not, depending on, you know, your needs. I'm kind of, I mean, unless you just like creating backstory for your own enjoyment, as, you know, J.R.R. Tolkien seemed to do, then I would rather spend my time, you know, making the minimum scaffolding necessary to build a building, you know.
Right.
So that said, hold on a sec. Hold on. Okay, so sorry, I don't know how much of my 2-year-old is getting picked up by the microphone.
No, that's all right.
A lot.
But anyway, he's downstairs banging, making a lot of noise. So the novel I'm working on now, actually the universe has been bouncing around in my head without really being written down for many years. And I had this idea of telling the story of the people who are at the top of the social structure, which is how I sort of thought of the universe. So I figured it out from that.
Mm-hmm.
And I never wrote a story about them. Like they just, I guess, never coalesced to the level of interest in me that I would write a story. And then I wound up working on other projects.
Yeah.
And then it occurred to me that I could write a story about the people on the bottom of the social structure. And suddenly the universe came alive and a novel came out of that. It started as a short story and it was too long for that. And I realized it was a novella and it was too long for that. And it wound up being a novel. So that's what I'm working on now. So I can't say that I put a lot of effort into the backstory in the sense of like writing stuff down. I mean, I wrote down a few things once I started the novel so that I could write the novel, but mostly it's about these characters. And often when I write a short story, I start with an image. And I have no idea about the world. I know nothing about the world until I start figuring out what the image means. I have an image, and then I have a character interacting with the image, and then I get a vector out of that, or I don't, and it gets abandoned. But if I do, there's a movement of plot happens, and the backstory fills itself in as needed to create the story. So I'm really like, oftentimes don't have any backstory at all until I'm writing. Right? It doesn't have the context. Now, when I was younger, I used to create like whole backstories, which were ideas for like fantasy role-playing campaigns that could also serve as settings for stories. But I haven't actually made use of them for that. So,
Yeah,
that's my experience. I don't spend a lot of time doing the backstory, and I think writers, because like we're talking to writers here, right? Our audience. I think that people should try different things and see what works for them. See if they really need to spend. Because if you're spending if you spend too much time on the backstory, it might scratch the writerly itch enough that you don't ever write anything in that universe. Because to my mind, coming out with the universe is the easiest part, and the plotting and the characters are harder. So I could just come up with universe after universe after universe with no story in them.
well, everybody has their own way of getting to getting to story.
Yeah, but that's me. So
I will say that I have found that now that I have so much data in my head, it's become more difficult to set that aside to get to the story that I want to tell. And I don't want to do these Stevensonian core dumps of look at how much research I've done.
Yeah.
And it's not my style anyway, but part of me does want to write the Tolkien-esque saga of the whole story of how we got to this place. I think the story is actually interesting within the context. So I do think there's a danger in getting so enraptured by your world building that you kind of forget to tell a story.
Yeah.
Well, are we talking about, when I think of backstory, I tend to think of character backstory specifically. So how did this character get to be in this place? And that can lead to what is the world like to have a character be in that place. And sometimes it is the thing that I got a little lost in, which is how did that character's parents get to be in the place that they were to affect the character in the way that they do.
So I think, in fact, one of the things that I'd like to point out at this point is that the thing that brings us to create back histories is a particular set of questions. And these questions typically are how or why. Right? So how did this character get here? Right? Why does this character feel motivated to do X? Right? those both can be related to personal history, right? But you can even say, even look at questions of, well, we've got this ruler who has these particular characteristics, and say to yourself, why in the world is a person this problematic in charge of the place? Right? How the heck did that happen? And then actually, if you try to answer it, could happen to become a whole novel, which is what happened to me because I had a ruler who had some real issues, and I was like, how the heck did he get to be the ruler? And then I wrote a novel about it. So it became a front story, I guess, but it started out as a backstory. And I think the problem was that when I wrote it as a backstory, it was so complex that I had a really hard time capturing it with the usual methods that one uses for backstory, which is to say, trying to capture it in a very brief way. The other reason to write a front story in order to figure out a backstory is because sometimes, unless you're directly engaged in the story problems, you can't figure out the details of how things happened. So that is a tool. It can be useful for working through backstory and trying to figure out its consequences, is writing an entire story about the backstory, but it's not necessary. On the other hand, you get things like a lot of the stuff that we set up, sort of the background conditions for a story that we're writing. We don't necessarily spend enough time saying, well, but why are those the background conditions, right? So, for example, I've mentioned this in previous Hangouts offhandedly, but I had a moment when I was creating the Varan world when I realized that everybody had the same religion. And I was like, uh-oh. Either this is supremely unrealistic because I haven't done enough work creating different religions, or there has to be a backstory for why everybody would have the same religion in this place.
I'd like to poke at that, please.
Please poke away.
I think that all depends upon whether you have a culture where the religion is sort of considered to be the property of the culture or the property of the individual. And so Westerners are currently used to being in a culture where religion is very individual, and so there are many, many, many religions around, but there are many other cultures out there where the religion is sort of the property of the culture. And so, yes, everybody is participating in the same basic religion. So it wouldn't occur to me that that is necessarily a what's wrong with this culture story, unless the culture is set up so that there shouldn't be just one religion. Does that make sense, what I just said?
It does.
Yeah, like Rome. Like everybody was like Catholic when Rome was in control of so much of Europe. And it was a given everybody was Catholic or some kind of heathen or pagan to be stomped out.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think even in a situation where religion is the property of the culture, there's going to be a historical background for that.
Yeah, because like Rome was pretty
I don't know about the Roman example.
Well, I mean, not Rome.
I don't know that Rome is the example we want to use here.
Catholic. I meant like the Vatican, like because I mean they were pretty gung ho about converting people and then keeping everything.
Wait. Now we're talking about proselytizing religions versus other things.
Yeah,
well, no, but I mean, like there was just sort of like the one-ish religion, like.
No, what I'm saying is when you have like, if you were writing about, say, pre-contact Hawaii, then yes, there's one religion there. If you're talking about, writing a Japan that predates Chinese contact with Buddhist evangelizers, then yes, you're talking about one native set of worldviews. I mean, if you were writing about the Viking era before Christianity came by, these are all places that had a religion, because this is about religion as, like I said, it's your culture's religion, not your own personal religion.
Yeah, even now there are a number of groups around the world where religion is just an aspect of identity, like the Druze in Lebanon and Israel. And they're all Druze. That's their religion, that's their culture, that's, although some of them are secular, but they're never not Druze. And there's no like concept of conversion. There's the Sikhs, right? There's the Parsi, who are all Zoroastrian. So, if you're Sikh, then your religion is Sikh and your ethnic identity is Sikh. So
so I think that religion and cultural identity are intertwined with one another, for sure.
Sometimes they're synonymous.
So basically in the case of religion, it's something where, okay, I guess where I was trying to go with it was, I had created something via default, and I wanted to make sure that it was non-default, right? And so
that's reasonable.
And so, especially since there were other characteristics of the world that made it pretty clear that these people had not originated there, it made a lot of sense for me to say, oh, gee, they must have been religious fugitives from somewhere else. And it wasn't like that was the only conclusion I could have drawn. At the same time, it helped a lot for me to elaborate my concept.
Sure. Did that,
yeah.
Once you figured that out, did that affect the stories in that world in other ways?
Yeah. And in the end, of course, there ends up being more than one religion, but there are only two. So.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, so why do people, Varan has a huge caste system. Why would there be a caste system? So there are reasons for that as well. And there are reasons why nobody knows why the caste system exists, right? But anytime you have something on the page that's important, it's worth asking how it came to be or why it is, right? I mean, and we were just talking.
If that's useful to you, can I jump in just respond to that one last sentence real quick? If you're writing a first draft and figuring out why or how something came to be will kill your momentum, don't do it. Do it in the edits, right?
Yeah.
Because that could very well, like if I were writing a book, that would kill my momentum to stop. Oh, and I have to stop and figure out the logic behind the world that I'm exploring. It's like I have a dark room and a flashlight, and my story is the flashlight, and I'm shining it in different places, and I'm discovering different things, right? And later on, when I'm done, I can go flip the light switch and see, what I missed and what I didn't miss. But certainly in a first draft, I'm much better with a flashlight.
I need to have I need to explore it. if I get to a place where I need to know what's going on, then I really need to know what's going on. So I won't be able to move forward until I decide why it is that way, or how the characters got to be there, how the world got to be that way. And I can decide how much of that I need to know and then proceed from there.
Mhm.
If I think it's going to stop me from working on it, yeah, sure, I will put it aside. But it is sometimes that's stuff that you need to know. You don't need to put it in the story necessarily. You don't, when you do research for a story, you know, that is based on existing backstory, as it were, when you do research in on our world, because you want to talk about airplanes, you don't put all of the material into the story. You don't say, okay, here are the books that I read and this is what the book said. Your research informs your work, informs your writing. And the backstory, whether you write it in notes or as a story in another file, or you just make it up and don't write it down, that will inform what you're doing. And sure, if it gets in the way, don't do it. But
Right.
we're
I mean, I
kind
think
of
what
talking
we're
about
looking at
doing
here,
it.
we're looking at
I want
the
to
question of relevance. How relevant is it? Why
I wanna-
things work this way?
put on my sensitivity reader hat for a moment.
Okay.
I encounter people who spent a lot of time writing a story and they didn't question the premises of why their world building was what it was and why their characterizations were what they were to start with. And then they have thousands of words invested in characters that or situations that are going to make the internet fall on their head.
Mm-hmm.
Doing some interrogation early on about how did we get here? Oh, and I'm going to not identify this particular story, but it's part of a named scandal. You know, oh, I just want to have megafauna in North America and magic. How you get to megafauna and magic is really important because this is no longer 1950 something. And in 2018 and beyond, we don't want to become authors or other sorts of creators who have a reputation for having been really callous about important things to people. And so I think that, oh, I have a story I want to tell is really, it's important. And will this kill my momentum is important. But there are some stories that, you know, and I think this about some of my own stories. Maybe that one doesn't need to be told if I don't have the sufficient, you know, not in not in wordsmithing skill, but in context and understanding. Maybe that's not the story that I'm supposed to tell. Maybe I should release that story seed out in the world and let someone else tell that story from a more nuanced and accurate vision. And I'm still on team fresh visions and unusual insights are really good, but I think you should listen to that nagging voice that says, but wait, how did we get here? And I think you should kind of know, okay, we got here because I made these assumptions and I'm okay with these assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
As a sensitivity reader, I am never telling the author, don't do this. All I'm saying is, hey, I am acting as your canary here, and I think that these are problem points, but you know, you should know, we make these decisions, we say, oh, you can't please everybody, but you should know who you're displeasing.
Yeah.
And maybe figure out what assumptions you're making and what that's going to affect.
Yeah. So here's, I'm gonna return to the Varn example because it's actually another aspect of it. there was a point at which I decided that I was in trouble because everybody was white. And I just inherently see that as a problem. But at the same time, I was thinking to myself, well, wait a second. I've got this situation where I've got people who have been living underground for 1,000 years. Right? If living underground was somehow natural for them, you know, how could they be anything but white? And then I was like, well, but wait a second, I got this they were religious fugitives thing. and that actually helped me, because, you know, I mean, basically the whole thing about them all being white was me being a newbie and really not having gotten to the point where I had yet interrogated some of the things that went into my gut creation, right? And I went back and I was like, wait a second, if they are religious fugitives, they can be from a religion that spread across an area, and many of the people could be from different kinds of ethnic groups, right? And I don't know much about them, but they would certainly have different appearances phenotypically. And then you take those people and you mix them up in this new environment. And yes, some of those features may become less noticeable. And yeah, okay, you're still going to have the factor that people aren't spending a lot of time in the sun. But the consequence of that is that you are not actually dealing with a completely homogeneous population as though they were just Morlocks or something.
So I think that because I get critiqued about this a lot, I don't know that every single world that all of us writes needs to be diverse, but we have to understand why it's not diverse.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I actually have pockets in this particular story I'm writing where I have written stories about essentially pre-contact cultures, and they're not modeled in any indigenous culture, but they're just cultures that have grown up in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, you know, one of the things we like to explore as genre writers in science fiction is, what do we think of ourselves once we encounter the aliens?
Mm-hmm.
Do we still see ourselves as all of the different things we are, or do we coalesce into having an identity of ourselves as a more unified thing? And so, I mean, one of the things in here is that I get criticized, and I said, oh, you never want to write the reality that some cultures are just really monolithic. And I'm like, no, it's interesting to write monolithic cultures, but you should know that it's a small scale close in that you're doing in order to get to that. And that within that, in the same way that we joke about how the fights in academia are so vicious because they're so small, if you have what seems like a monoculture from the outside, you're going to have tiny differences that seem very big and important within that particular context.
Yeah.
And so this is how you end up with caste issues, how you end up with things like minor doctrinal issues. I mean, we talk about the prevalence of Roman Catholicism at a point before Protestantism, but the truth is it was an era of schisms and heresies and massive doctrinal fights and wars of ecclesiastical succession, and there's all sorts of stuff happening. So it's not, I think, a question of, is my world homogenous, but what kinds of conflicts and what kind of harmonies exist in my world? Where are the places where the characters have to negotiate their differences versus what are the things they take for granted about each other? So I think that going, oh, why is everybody one religion, is a great question. But I think because we're doing this as a webcast, I want to bring up the idea that it's okay for everybody to be one religion as long as you know why.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. And I think sorry, I'm getting Did
I just kill the webcast?
No, I'm getting running commentary from Kate, who's not able to join on speaking. But I need to make sure that I'm keeping up with what she's saying.
Yeah, I don't see what she's saying.
Yeah. So anyway, so I think that well, so there's an entirely different topic inherent in the idea of subcultures and sub subcultures, and you know, and it's one of the things that I first wrote about when I was writing my blog, but I think it would take a long time to explore. Basically, whatever group you have, there are going to be different kinds of people in it, and you know, whatever. Even if you have people who are generally speaking all very devoted to a particular set of ideals, people are different, and they're going to have to grapple with those ideas in different ways. And so one of the things that you should really not be doing is having any character say anything like, I am an elf and therefore I believe this, right? Just don't.
Well,
I mean, I think
you could have them
elf supremacist or elf apologists believing this, but I think that perhaps you might want to show elves that aren't like that.
Well, you could have somebody say this is who I am, this is what we all are, and have somebody else saying, another elf standing up and saying, no, not really.
Right. Well, you can make it a point of contention, but there are too many stories out there where people run true to type, and you don't get a sense of the idea. There's really no idea that, hey, there are cultures involved here, not just different species who happen all to have the same same ideas because they are that identity. And now Kate is telling me she wants an elven civil war with elf supremacists.
I missed half of what
I shouldn't have talked over Juliet. I said I'm an Aryan cookie cutter robot monster. I don't know about you. Aren't we all? Wait, oops.
But what was Kate saying she wanted?
It's an elven civil war with elf supremacists.
Cool.
Yeah, because that's the other thing that you know you can say is okay. You know, we're all elves, but you've got gender and height and what differences among people.
Mm-hmm.
Wait. Isn't that what Tolkien was? An elf civil war with elf supremacists?
Yeah, there were the light elves and the dark elves, or the Noldor. There were, yeah.
Well, and weren't the orcs like corrupted elves or something?
Orcs are corrupted elves, yes.
Okay, there we go. Okay,
That's not racist at all. Never mind.
And giants are corrupted ents. And troll, or was it trolls? Maybe it's trolls who are corrupted ents.
That sounds, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's trolls, but anyway,
Yeah. So anyway, yes. There's a good article about race in fantasy role-playing games being the original sin of fantasy role-playing games because
that's a really good article.
Which is good for writers as well. And this has actually been something I've been thinking about for like a couple decades. I made a few attempts to write my own fantasy role-playing games in my 20s without race, using the word race at all. And so that was pretty clear from the get-go, if you think about it. But I do like the idea of, I mean, it's again like any other community that you represent. If you have more than one person from that community, then you can have different points of view among those different members, and that's true of real communities or fantastical communities. So in your world building, which getting back to world building, even if you have like one example of a particular culture or species or planet or whatever, then maybe in the backstory there's a couple more that are different, that have a little bit of a sense of, and that way that will inform the decisions you make for that character, the one that's on screen.
So I think, in fact, that back history is, in some sense, the bridge between character and world. Because of the fact that a person's past experiences inform who they are, and they can be also part of events that have formed the way this world is. Now, obviously, not everybody is Forrest Gump, right? And not every character you run into is going to have had experiences that happen also to have been incredibly important historically.
No, all of early human invention and development was done by one blonde woman in Northern Europe.
Oh my
Cave
god.
person.
Oh, that's Ayla. Yes.
Oh my god, yes, God, that was so frustrating. But
I really kind of want to write a I'm not going to, and I'm gonna just note, Gene, I really enjoyed the books even as they were problematic, but I kind of want to write a fic, some work in dialogue with that series where like the time traveler goes and accidentally kills Ayla, and then what happens to their spaceship, since all technology depends on Ayla.
Yeah.
I literally had a student the other day who had the name Ayla, and I looked at her and I said, I know what your mother was using for basically fat fodder. And she was like, I was named by my uncle. I said, okay, I know what your uncle was basically using for fat fodder. And yeah, it was a good time. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway,
They just thought it was a pretty name now.
it is a pretty name.
It'll just make a lot of people think possibly inappropriate thoughts, but lots of names have all sorts of baggage. Now everybody in the world is named Cat, so I'm not quite sure what to do with that anymore.
This does seem to be quite a common name.
It wasn't at one point, I swear.
Yeah.
And it's really annoying having adopted it as an effort to get away from all the other common abbreviations for the whole set of names it comes from. I kind of want to yell, "Hey, all of you, get off of my name!"
But you don't have a
not
cane
sure-
to shake.
I'm not sure what the knockdown, drag out, epic battle of all the cats for the nomenclature comes down to. I'm pretty sure Cat Buyer would be able to take me down, and I'd have to be named something else. So I'm not going to start that.
Let's not do the Cat Thunderdome.
Sounds bad.
Well, 2 cats enter, 1 cat leaves.
But see, this is also a world building question, right? Why does everybody have a distinct name?
Sure.
Well, I mean, so I run into things where I've created names for characters and in one story and then gone to another story, and that story happens to bring together 2 characters whose names start with the same letter. When I was really
some of us have favorite phonemes
from having names that started with the same letter in other stories. I don't know.
Don't read Tolkien, because he bases it on like the Eddas and other sagas, in which lots of characters have the names that alliterate, and even the same name being used for character after character, generation after generation. Right?
Well, in some cultures we number them, but if you don't have a culture that believes in numbering, now you've got a problem. Now you've got epithets. There's also, have you noticed that in science fiction we don't favor epithets very much?
Like what are you referring to specifically?
Well, I mean, it's a classic thing from like that Northwestern Europeans, right? So and so the unready and
oh yeah.
Right.
The this and the that.
Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever. Elric was Elric Kinslayer. He was based on sagas. So there were a series of epithets about him. And kennings, actually, which Tolkien used, which is, not saying the name, like
There's
Durensbane, for instance, or whatever.
Yeah.
We don't seem to do this in science fiction. Everybody's got like, a government name. I kind of am now suddenly thinking, do I need to play with names for characters? But I think that
Mhm.
once you have a certain number of cast, the reader starts to get kind of lost. And I know that I've read various stories with a lexicon and a and a cast of characters next to me as I take notes. Oh, okay, so and so. Now we've discovered that so and so is so and so's kid and is married. And I'm like writing out the family tree as I'm writing this, because if I were reading a fantasy novel, it might all be in an appendix for me. But I'm reading in a different genre, so I have to generate it myself.
And this is a thing about how complex your world can be, is, you know, what's realistic and what can the reader keep a hold of while they're keeping track of the story.
Timelines. I have somebody who is sadly just dropped out of my local writers critique group, because he's a former lawyer, and so he's a stickler for timelines. And so if you have screwed up and said that something happened X amount of time ago, and then you say later it happened at Y amount of time ago, and the difference between X and Y isn't the delta between the first telling and the second telling, he was just going to go, hey, you don't have this happening at the same time, because he's sort of interrogating it as if it's some kind of alibi or something. It's a great practice, because when you're writing it yourself, you don't often notice, and you just gloss over, oh yeah, I said X many years, whatever, and you go on. And
Yeah.
Timelines are an important part of backstory that
Actually,
many
I think
of us
I'm
don't
really
do
glad
as
you
well.
brought them up, because I think they're really important. I mean, and certainly for me, they're important because foreign stories happen on a very long timeline. So, you know, from the perspective of where we are chronologically in this story, how long ago was it that this particular event happened? I do ask myself those things.
I've been looking at how many generations have been in these various cultures. And so did they actually leave in this diaspora wave, or do I need to invent a different diaspora wave? Because what's more important to me, that there was one giant wave, or that I have enough of a culture established over there that it's been through enough rounds of children growing up in that culture, so that it is an intrinsic culture as opposed to sort of a diaspora culture that hasn't really found its own footing yet. So yeah, complicated stories result in complicated timelines. I start to think that maybe I should just go write really simple short stories.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'll just write essays instead. Essays are easier.
Yeah, you say that now, but you'll wind up doing a super complicated short story that then balloons into a novel. I speak from personal experience.
Now, see, it's interesting because I generally don't need full-on timelines for my books. Everything usually takes place in a very short amount of time. Generally a week to 2 weeks is about as long as I go for having a plot line go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it all depends on what's happening in the story.
Yeah.
Because my novel takes place over, I'm not really sure right now, about 3 weeks to a month.
Mm-hmm.
But at a certain point, something really dramatic happens. And when that happens, it actually sets off a timeline of governmentally regulated events that are required to follow this particular type of event. Right? So basically it's when the eminence dies, we have to have an heir selection, and it has to run on the following schedule. And so while I was writing the novel, I had to have my timeline. Okay, how many days has it been? Okay, 3 days. We have to have another heir selection event on this day. What else is going to converge with that? You know? So it really depends on what kind of story you're telling. But yeah.
I've been watching Father Brown Mysteries on Netflix right now.
Yeah.
And it's very much grounded in Catholic history, right? So, you know, all sorts of things show up. The ways in which unmarried pregnant women were treated, and how priest holes worked, and various things. And so there's a whole bunch of because of the nature of the stories they're telling, there's a whole bunch of backstory about Catholicism in England that becomes really important, where it wouldn't be in some of the story. And so, you know, each individual episode is taking 3 days or so, but it's standing on a foundation of decades and decades and hundreds of years of things that have happened. And they're also working with sort of holding back enough so that the people who know are entertained and that they can inform the people who don't know. So it's interesting watching it as how do you handle the cultural information that's necessary in order to make the story go. I don't have a Catholic perspective, so I don't know that I'm getting an accurate read on this. I don't know how skewed it is, but it's giving me a thing that I, you know, was getting from reading Chaim Potok a long time ago, when I was getting a particular subset of Jewish culture because of the framing of the stories, or there's Kellerman stories, which the Jewishness of the characters matters. And so in order for us to tell stories that aren't just really light or very much grounded in the world that our probable reader is in, I think we do need to explore what's going on and to think about what we do and don't need to include. And coming in with both very familiar readers with the culture or analogous cultures, or coming in with people who are totally fresh, because I've had my genre fiction read by people who don't understand genre fiction at all. And they get stuck on things like, you know, I will have created some kind of 3D printer sort of, you know, synthesizer, Star Trek replicator sort of thing. And we now take this for granted as a genre trope. And the readers who don't read this genre thing are going, wait, what? What is that? How does that work? And I want to just say, don't pay any attention to that. It's not the important part.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's another whole topic inherent in the question of how do we indicate to readers what's important and what's not important, what they should just sort of take as a given and what they should interrogate. You know, because you don't have full control over what a reader is going to want to interrogate. But at the same time, there are ways to market in your text so that people are like, oh, okay, that's a thing. I just need to remember that word and keep it going forward, you know?
Because I'm in this mystery mode right now, I'm also thinking about like Nero Wolfe stories where you don't get the recipe, you just get the name of the dish he ate. And then there are these kitchen cookbook cozy stories where, you know, the author will have included a recipe for the thing that the character was making.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Miss Wimble Womble's cherry clafouti. and here we digress into a thing because it's sort of the flavor of the story. And now I'm wondering whether there are knitting mysteries that include like shawl patterns in them. There's fiction written for a much more male audience where it talks about the tiny details of like gunsmithing.
Yeah.
Because it's, you know, the author will have turned it into the passion of the character. And so I guess circling back to world building and backstory, there's also a question of, you know, what does your character care about?
Yes, that is big.
You know, Harrison Ford's character in Blade Runner doesn't care how his gun is made.
Yeah.
There are other characters out there who are very, very impassioned about their guns or their cars or whatever. So I always come back to two things when I'm deciding how much backstory is necessary. One of them is how much does your character care? And how much is all the stuff that the character might or might not be caring about affecting the character in relation to other characters in the world that they inhabit? So, and it's a kind of a bathtub curve, if you know what I mean. It's very exaggerated in both extremes, where if they're very much in sync with their culture, you need to write a lot about their culture, and if they're very much out of sync with their culture, you also need to explain how it is they're out of sync with. So I guess in my head, I always have a graph of where my characters are in relation to their surroundings and their level of parallax with everybody else around them.
Yeah. Well, gosh, we ate up an hour on that pretty quickly.
How did that happen?
I enjoyed hearing about what you guys had worked on. So, I mean, this is I always feel like I'm just getting to the interesting part right at the end of the hour. But I mean, I think we've covered a lot of interesting things. To me, this is one of the basic topics of world building. I think that this is something that you really need to think about if you want to take the idea of world building to the next level. And as you think about your world, its history is something, and and your character's personal history, both are things that you should really put some of your mental resources into as you get started. So I hope this was helpful for people who may look at it later, and I will thank you all for being here. So next week, Callie Robson is going to come on a show and talk about her recent Tor.com novella, Gods, Monsters, and the Lucky Peach. So that should be super fun. And we are on schedule for the 15th, and I think that's the standard time at 4 p.m. So
Awesome.
I will look forward to seeing you then, and I'm going to stop the broadcast.